everybody. Welcome to the Rainbow Kids training. My name is Azisa. I am the lead trainer and events coordinator with the San Mateo County Pride Center. And I support and coordinate trainings ranging from our LGBTQ 101 to more in-depth pronouns 101 and trans 101 trainings.
And I'm Nathaniel Flynn. I use he and they pronouns, and I've been an early childhood educator for over 15 years. I've worked with infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, and I'm also the co-author of Supporting Gender Diversity in Early Childhood Classrooms, a practical guide, right, for teachers and family members. And through that, I'm a part of Gender Justice in Early Childhood, an organization that advocates for all children's gender health and supports educators and parents to talk about gender diversity with young children.
So here's just a very brief overview of what we'll cover in the workshop today. We just are going to go through some brief introductions about what to expect. Then we'll discuss identities, focusing really on gender and love, and how we can create age-appropriate ways to support having conversations about these topics. We'll then also take a look at the messages and biases children receive from the world around them. Next, we'll talk about how to create a more expansive and inclusive environment for all. Then we'll get some practice in on using pronouns and telling stories that welcome diversity of gender and roles in our children's lives. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and about 30 minutes just going over some Q&A and questions. But really, above all else, the primary goal for this training is to educate and think about the messages children receive about gender, love, and families. And this training is going to highlight both inclusive and not so inclusive examples of gender and love, while providing the opportunity to reflect on what we're told and what we can unlearn. Challenging these messages can be difficult, so we want to help you all grasp the basic grounding language to support you all when you're having conversations about gender and diverse families with your children. We love audience participation, and though our abilities to interact with you all is limited to here today, there will be plenty of opportunities to engage throughout the training at home or during the conference. We will also offer time to pause and reflect on some of the concepts and scenarios we'll share. We also invite you to pause the video at any time if you're at home, to discuss with others if you're able to, and reflect on any of the content covered. And finally, we want to let you know that all the resources and organizations mentioned throughout the training will be shared through a QR code provided at the end of this presentation, as well as additional resources. And for in-person conference participants, you all will also receive a handout with these same resources.
We created this training thinking about all families because all of us are navigating gender and love and relationships, our own and other people's. And all of us are in a world where LGBTQ people exist and deserve to be treated well. This is a 101 training and focused on why and how to start having conversations with young children about diversity as it pertains to gender, love, and families. And we want to specifically welcome participants who are or have LGBTQ plus family members, whether that's you or someone you love.
We'll talk in a little bit about how communities develop their own constructions of gender and sexuality, but right now I want us to talk a little about intersectionality. So yes, there is an LGBTQ community, but even within the community, we have experiences and identities that make us unique. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to highlight how aspects of who we are, like our age, our disability and ability status, and more, influences the privileges and disadvantages we face. For example, if we had 3 LGBTQ youth at school, however, one is Black, one is Asian, and one is white, they hold overlapping experiences within their LGBTQ identities, but may experience oppression and racism differently because of their racial and ethnic backgrounds. Diversity should be celebrated and honored, while also being considerate of not everyone holding the same privilege as others. Even though we as presenters may not be able to see your faces, we know that everyone in this space is uniquely themselves, and that's a beautiful thing.
We want to take a moment to recognize that talking about gender and sexual orientation with young children can feel really personal and may feel complex. So many of us grew up with negative messages about LGBTQ plus people in media and in our cultures. You may have also grown up with negative messages from your family, your religious community, your school community, or more. Or with families and communities that just didn't talk about these topics with us when we were young. So often, topics like bias and identity are seen as adult or mature topics. The assumption is that being silent about these topics is protective, but the silence we experience has an impact. It may have left us not knowing what to say now. It can also mean that we took in those negative messages in our societies because they were the only ones available. And we need some time to recognize that those messages are inside us, whether or not we want them to be, and whether or not we agree with them. In this way, the silence around gender diversity and sexual orientation with young children perpetuates and even exacerbates the bias in the world. We need to find ways to talk about these topics in age-appropriate language. Throughout this training, we'll be working on that. One example to start with is about sexual orientation. An age-appropriate way of talking about this is to be focused on families and love. What can families look like? In children's home, in their community, and in their play? Who can a child imagine themselves to be or become? We want you to leave this training feeling like you have the knowledge and autonomy to make choices about how you engage with the children in your lives, and about these topics, and to be thoughtful about the ways you support a child's understanding of themselves and their community. We want to empower you with information and reflection tools so that you can nurture and support the children in your life to safely explore who they are and who is in their world, and to recognize them as the narrators of their own experiences. In other words, while you have influence over the children in your lives, they know who they are at this moment, and they are building their own understanding of their experiences.
So now we're going to talk about identities, really focusing in on gender and love. So we all have these components of who we are, our bodies, our identities, how we express ourselves, and who we love. There's this cultural narrative that each of those things are linked in a very prescribed way. If we can know what your genitals are, then we know how you identify. And we label this as sex assigned at birth through the presence of certain anatomy, as well as chromosomes and etc. The cultural narrative around this then creates assumptions about what you'll like to play with or do, how you'll want to dress, and when you grow up, who you'll love. For example, if we have a vulva, or if you have a vulva, you'll identify as a girl. You'll want to have long hair and wear dresses and dolls and play with dolls, and you'll eventually grow up to love men. And that can be true for so many people. But the idea that anything different than this is not okay or just doesn't exist is where bias against the LGBTQ community starts and damage is done. The implication that anything outside of the binary male or female categorization is viewed as abnormal, and this can lead to folks being viewed as less than, and that's neither safe nor affirming. So we want to be clear that while these are all aspects of being human, there is diversity within each aspect that we don't want to ignore or vilify, and that each aspect is not inherently linked. You love who you love, you like what you like, you are who you are, and you have the body you have. And you are deserving of acceptance, understanding, support, and community in the same way that our children are.
So let's take a moment to think about this from a young child's perspective. Young children are learning about gender and love and families. Whether or not we are intentionally talking about it, gender and relationships are visible to children, and children have their own sense of self and are forming ideas about who people can be. While their own sexual orientation comes later, their sense of their gender and what's possible starts now. For example, by the time they're turning 1, most children can show us that they're thinking about gender and making categories for the groups of people they see. For example, a 12-month-old might say something or sign something that says daddy about everyone they think of as a man, similar to how they might call every 4-legged creature dog. We'll also see gender awareness in studies of young infants' attention to images. It shows that they are paying attention and noticing when things are different than what they expected. By 2, we'll see children start to reflect ideas about gender in their home culture. So in my cultural context, that can mean pointing to a picture of kids with short hair and saying, boy, or giving a truck to a boy to play with, or choosing to only play with dolls. And by 2.5 years old, children will share about who they are. You can probably picture a child this age saying, I'm a big girl, or loving to wear a color or a texture of clothing, or being uncomfortable with certain kinds of clothing. Those are all aspects of sharing who they are and what they like. I also know kids this age that are clear they're not the gender we assume them to be. I've known children this young start telling people they trust that they're a boy, not a girl, or a girl, not a boy, as soon as they could talk. We'll also see young children not identifying with a gender binary at this age. This can look a number of different ways, including focusing on their name, like saying, I'm Rowan, if asked if they're a boy or a girl, or focusing on being a kid, or getting really into playing an animal character and talking about being that animal as an alternative to talking about gender. While these are some examples of how young children express themselves around gender, we also know that all children are different and developing in their own ways. How are the children in your life expressing themselves? How are you able to connect with their ideas about gender and who they are? And in terms of developmental arches, over the next few years, in that 2.5 to 5 range, children will often have a lot to show us about how they are understanding gender, family, and love. Personally, it's been a long time since I went by a preschool classroom and without someone asking me if I'm a boy or a girl. And I can think of so many examples of children telling me, we're getting married, or we're creating a family game. And these are just some examples of how children could bring up age-appropriate ideas about LGBT identities. Unfortunately, we can also see the beginnings of gender and sexual orientation bias in children's play at this age. I'm guessing you can think of a time when a child said something like, boys can't be dancers, or no girls allowed. We also see children self-censoring their play and their playmates, particularly when they're playing in large groups, and limiting what they have access to and who they get to know. Fortunately, though children may sound very convinced about their ideas, in my teaching, I've seen how often they are truly open to learning and changing. You may have heard this metaphor that children's brains are like sponges, soaking everything in. You've probably experienced their growth and ability to do this firsthand. There are so many amazing things going on, and we know that young children observe, categorize, and make meaning from their experiences. We also know that they look to trusted people in their lives to help them understand and interpret those experiences. So when a child does say, boys can't be dancers, we can help them understand that everyone can dance by ensuring they have access to seeing men dance, reading books like Dance by Bill T. Jones, and talking about movement or having dance parties. We can help boys access the motor development, joy, and connection that comes from dancing. And we can help all kids accept and include the boys that are drawn to dancing. This is a small example of what we can do about bias and discrimination. Children see and replicate the biases in their culture unless someone is there to help them reflect, think, and do something different. We can be there to help them think about and challenge unfair ideas. And there are consequences if we stay silent. And there are consequences if we stay silent. Children learn that adults accept stereotypes and that they should too. Silence can even create fear. For children, it can seem like the topic is so dangerous, adults can't even talk about it. We also know that silence has a profound impact on children's sense of themselves, particularly if they happen to be one of the people that adults aren't talking about. So one example of this comes from the 2015 US Trans Survey by the National Center for Trans Equity, the most recently published study of transgender people by transgender people. Of over 27,000 respondents, 60% began to feel their gender was different from their assigned gender by age 10, but only 5% started to tell others. Think about the fear, shame, and isolation those 95% of children were living with for so long. We cannot decide who children are, but we can support and influence how they feel about themselves and other people.
So now let's look at the stereotypes that surround young children every day. So if we know that there's a need to have inclusive and expansive conversations about gender as adults, it's also important that we begin these conversations with our young children. And let's just take a moment to think about what examples our children are influenced by at an early age. So for folks that are at home, I invite you to pause and just reflect. What are some examples? And for folks that are directly at the conference, maybe share with another partner, what are some examples of girls and boys stereotypes that you all see? We often hear nowadays conversations about getting rid of the gender binary, but what is that? Binaries are what we call when two things are in opposition to one another. For example, cats versus dogs, or princes versus princesses. And within these binaries, we have specific characteristics, beliefs, norms, and more that are associated with specific binaries. And for a long time, gender has been considered a binary, girls versus boys. We see this show up in gender norms or actions, beliefs, and cultural understandings of how we define gender. For example, to affirm girlhood, we give our daughters unicorns, dolls, houses, and more. And to affirm boyhood, we give our sons blue items, Tonka trucks, and action figures. We gender everything, which is not inherently wrong, but we also have to consider some examples of absurd gendering. So once again, I invite folks that are at home to just take a moment to pause. And for folks that are at the conference to just share with a partner, look at some of these products. What are these objects? And what do you all initially observe? What items are for girls or for boys? And how do we know this? Pickles, earplugs, and wipes are objects we wouldn't think to gender, but we do. And it's served to us as adults, right? So when we think about how much young children are learning, we know that they're taking in these cultural norms and these influences on a daily basis just by interacting with some of these products. Though despite how absurd they are, the reality is that they have become so embedded into society that it's become almost a norm. And the most strongest example of gendered products is in kids' toys. When merging concept of gender norms, the most common way that we normalize this binary for children is through early childhood toys. And on the left side, you can pause and see, we see toys like baby carriages, makeup, and house sets. And all of these toys attribute to girls' stereotypical gender norms and expectations of caring about physical appearance and domestic roles. And on the right side, we see toys for boys, like pirate ships, T-Rexes, and more, that attribute to boys, emphasizing violence and aggression. So when we normalize these toys as girls and boys items, we're also telling children that in order to inform their gender, these are the skills they must learn and perform starting at an early age. But for kids who are exploring their identity, for example, their gender, this may be a confusing notion. The assumption that there are only two categories of gender, as that's what gets replicated and reinforced in society, may not be affirming to them. Additionally, for kids who aren't exploring their gender identity, not interacting with gendered toys may send a message to them that they are not the norm, viewed outside of the box, and this can also be harmful. So rather than reinforcing gendered toys, we want to give children the freedom to choose items that make them happy. And doing so supports the unlearning of gender binaries, social constructions of set genders, and highlights the freedom for children to explore what is good for them. So I'll invite folks to pause if they want to read this quick quote, but I'll also read it as well. If it was really natural to be a woman or a man, why do people spend so much time telling children how to do it? This quote is really lovely because it summarizes why we're all here today. We acknowledge that we hold a significant influence over our children's identities, and that the construction of being a boy or a girl is not necessarily biological, but constructed by everyday society interactions and actions. So whether it be how we talk about gender roles or what society tells our children, it's important to support children who are and aren't exploring their identity by giving them the freedom and having the knowledge to have those discussions when time comes. It's also important for children to see representation in the world around them when it comes to family and love too. Unfortunately, most media and marketing tends to be limited towards heterosexual love. So, thinking about your favorite children's movie, my favorite movie growing up was The Princess and the Frog and Cinderella. If we look at this slide, it shows what children could see when they're shopping for dollhouse families. And typically, most toy companies will sell family sets that include one mom, one dad, one boy, and one girl, also all of the same ethnicity. So, until companies start carrying more diverse toys, we can actually mix and match dollhouses to widen our children's understanding of what kind of families exist in our world. We also acknowledge that representation starts within our own families. And we acknowledge that many families don't solely look this way. So we have to think about expanding our children's outlook and embracing room to appreciate inclusivity.
Talking about it, gender and relationships. So instead of staying silent and letting cultural norms, stereotype toys, and marketing be the main tools children have to understand diversity in the world, what can we do instead? We have influence over children's experiences. Where do we go? Where do we invite families to go with children? What does this give children access to? When you go there, how do you help them interpret what is happening? It also extends to who do you know? Personal relationships have a big influence on what children understand about the world. We encourage you to reflect on what relationships you're supporting in children's lives. We also want to keep in mind that relationships take time, particularly for young children. One-time events or experiences often highlight and reinforce the idea that this is different and not normal, making it seem extra separate and reinforcing bias. So we want to think about how do we build relationships over the long term rather than one-time events. We also have so much influence over what we talk about and when and how we share information about diversity in the world, as well as what we do and say when children are expressing a stereotype and bias. So how can we start having these conversations? I use a few different strategies. One is making sure to be calm and matter of fact about what I'm saying, but also somewhat pared down. For example, by saying there are lots of different ways to have a family. Children will ask questions when they are ready, and that will help you know what else they're trying to understand. Using language that you've heard kids use for themselves or their families is another way to find language for what you want to talk about. So for example, in my first classroom, one of my students called his moms mommy and mamai, so we did too. Another child I know would say, I'm an in-betweener, which was their way of describing being between a boy and a girl. Not everyone will want the same words used for them, so it's important to listen and mirror back their language. It's also important that we offer vocabulary about identity. As Jonathan Van Ness shared, In their 2022 Netflix series, they were 30 before they had a word for who they are. How do you build a strong sense of self if you feel like you're something that can't even be named? How are you ready to accept your friend's identity if you haven't heard of it before? Encourage conversation, share your observations, and ask children questions. Answer their questions, and let them know when you don't know something and learn about it together. While I'm focusing on spoken language in this slide, I also want to mention that children may use other ways to communicate, like sign or communication board. But these tools can be adapted to have inclusive signs and images. And which strategies I use is dependent on the children's own growth and development, and connecting with where a child is so important. And it's also dependent on context. I use different strategies when there's a conflict between children or something hard is happening than when I'm reading a book or we're chatting together or traveling in a car.
Instead of opting for gendered marketing, we want to encourage non-gendered examples of toys and clothes. It's important to show diversity to highlight that children should be able to play and explore their own understandings of gender norms. Some examples that you all might see on the slide are children using ironing boards, playing with toy trucks, and even embracing their chef talents. Overall, the images here serve to highlight that young kids can be and do whatever they want. And we should embrace the things they like rather than assume they like toys because society tells us it's correlated to their gender. Target has been working really hard on eliminating gendered toy aisles to help reduce gender stereotypes. And recently, California passed a law in 2021 that requires large retail stores to provide a gender-neutral toy section. Of course, these decisions don't come without complaints. Some folks say that creating gender-neutral aisles erases the skills that girls and boys should build at an early age. But the response to that is, if that's the case, then we must encourage our children to have the freedom of choice, to make conscious and supportive decisions about what they enjoy in order to develop their sense of identity. Watching our kids explore what they like and don't like is a beautiful process. Let's continue to watch them blossom. And when we talk about gender identity and gender expression, we should also be aware of how non-Western cultures develop their own norms. On the right side, we have an Ihimana individual from the traditional Zuni culture. Ihimana people are male-bodied folks who take on ceremonial roles of the women in their community. On the left side, we see a picture of President FDR as a child, dressed in traditional clothing for proper pictures with long hair. Most folks would not recognize him upon first appearance and may assume he was a girl based on his gender expression. But a key takeaway here is that diverse cultures hold diverse notions of gender, and that Western culture is not necessarily the norm, and constructions of gender norms have absolutely shifted over time. Based on how society shifts and changes, the mass consumed understanding of gender, gender norms, and gender expression also shift. We also want to name that when we think of non-Western communities, we assume that they are communities of the past, and that's simply not true so long as the culture is passed down by communities. It should actually be encouraged to show children diverse understandings of gender to support visibility, inclusion, and intersectionality.
So let's take some time to practice these strategies or use some of your own. In just a moment, I'll share a scenario and then ask you to think about what you could say or do in response. If you're at home, you can pause the video after the scenario, or we'll take a moment so that you can share with a partner if you're at the conference. So for the scenario, a small group of 3 children choose a small corner of the yard, a little bit away from other children in your class. They quickly settle into a family game they often play, where each of them pretends to be part of a cat family that lives at school. After a few minutes, Nia, another child in the class, approaches the pretend family, asking, "Can I play too?" You overhear a child say, "You can be the baby." Nia's body tenses, and she responds, "No, I don't want to be a baby. I want to be the mommy." And the child responds, You can't be the mommy. I'm the mommy. You can only have one mommy in a family. You can see that both children are getting frustrated and you decide to just support their conversation. What might you say? I'll give you a moment to think about the scenario, and if it's something that comes up in your classroom or your community. Is it something that families ask for your support with? Whether it's new and familiar, what might you say in response? I wish we could hear all of your ideas, but since we can't, and here are some ideas that we've heard from other audiences. Aren't we lucky? You can have families with two mommies. Do you remember Aisha and Andrea? They're both Nia's mommy. You could both be mommies just like they are. I wonder if you know some families do have two mommies. These kinds of conflicts are an opportunity to talk more about family diversity in your community. For example, saying something like, I wonder if you're thinking about your family, where you do have one mommy. But families can look a lot of different ways. Some, like yours, have one mom. Others, like Nia's, have two moms. Aisha and Andrea. Some families have zero moms. They might have two dads or one dad or a grandma who takes care of everyone. And in our play, we can create any family we want. I wonder what family the four of you can make together. As we talked about before, we're all navigating these pieces of what our body is, who we know ourselves to be, the balance between what we're drawn to and enjoy, in other words, our self-expression, and how that self-expression is received by others and fits in the context you're in, and the role of love in our lives, whether it's who's in our family, who we love now, or especially for kids, who we can imagine to grow up to love. And remember that that those aspects influence each other, but they don't cause each other. But we also know that there are all these stereotypes and cultural expectations and ideas that can feel like boxes were put inside for us as adults and for children too. We want to open up those boxes and offer ourselves and children more expansive and inclusive ways of understanding who we are and who other people can be. Bodies are one way to start thinking about diversity within gender. I grew up with the idea that there are two options. It starts with chromosomes. They form in particular ways, and that each way creates specific hormones and reproductive systems. But in reality, nature isn't that simple. Intersex is a term for when bodies don't fit into this binary. It's an umbrella term for a number of different ways this can happen. Intersex people make up about 2% of the population. That's the same as redheads and lefties. And intersex people can identify as male, female, or separate from the binary. So when I talk about bodies with children, I tend to talk about how we can make a guess about who someone is, and that we often make those guesses based on their body, but that those are guesses, and that the person knows who they are. We need to be ready to listen to them. Our bodies are important, but gender identity is about who someone is. It holds more truth and value. When I'm talking to someone, thinking about someone, teaching someone, I want to be focused on who they are. As Aziza shared, how we think and talk about gender varies over time and cultures. And for so many of us, also dealing with historical legacies of colonialism that erased and discriminated against certain types of people. One of the many legacies of this time is that language for LGBTQ+ people is often pathologized, missing, or has needed to be recreated and reimagined. So we might be using words for identity you haven't heard of before, and there will likely be other ones in the future. Right now, I hear a lot about how people can be cisgendered, basically meaning that the first guess generally fits them. It combines cis, the scientific prefix for unchanged, with gender. And transgender, which means that in some way the person doesn't fit that first guess. So they end up navigating some kind of change in their lives. So we're also combining the scientific prefix for change with gender to make transgender. And we know that people can identify as male, female, both, or neither. And folks who identify as either both or neither often use the term non-binary. And as Aziza shared earlier, depending on the language we're speaking, cultural background, and more, people can have even more words for themselves. But for this training, those are the general groups in English at the moment. We also want to take a moment to be thoughtful about fluidity, how all of us change over time, and the gender changes too. For some of us, that fluidity is the difference between being a girl and being a woman, or how becoming a parent can change how our identity and who we feel we are. And for some of us, those changes and what we choose to share about them involves names, pronouns, and finding new ways to talk about who we are. Those changes don't invalidate our present or our past. And as we talk with and listen to children about identity, we don't need to lock them into any one identity or assume what their identity right now means for their future. We can welcome and support who they are right now. So let's take some time to practice again. Like last time, I'll share a scenario and then ask you to think about what you could say in response. This scenario is written from a parent's perspective, so we're inviting you to think about it both as if you were the parent and from the teacher's perspective of how you could respond to a parent and if they brought this story to you and asked for your support. So during your child's bedtime routine, you often take time to share about how your day went. Even though your 4-year-old may not want to talk about his school day right when he gets home, you often find that he has a lot to say right when he's getting ready for bed. Most days you hear about what he and his friends built in the block area or played outside. Today, he says, "Today, Ria said, I'm a boy. I don't want to be the mom in your game. She got really mad at me when I said she wasn't a boy. Why did she say that?" I'll give you a moment to think about it. How might you respond to your own child? How might you respond if a parent brought you this story? If you're watching this at home, you can also pause the video if you want a little more time. But again, here are some suggestions. I don't know why Ria said that because I'm not Ria, but I do know that sometimes what you see isn't always how people feel. Ria told you something you didn't already know about who they are. We both thought of Ria as a girl, but Ria's telling us something else right now. We need to be ready to listen when someone tells us about who they are. Or, did you ask what Ria would like it to be instead of a mommy? Or, I want to remind you, only Ria knows who Ria is. If you have questions, I can help you think about what we could talk about with Ria tomorrow. It's so important that we find ways to support kids to be curious instead of confrontational when someone talks about who they are. And it's also important to be careful about protecting a child's privacy and not outing a transgender or gender creative child, not telling someone without their permission. Even though there's no medical intervention for young children and around gender identity, I still think it's helpful to think about trans identity as a private medical situation because it helps me maintain the professional boundaries I need to. Just like you wouldn't share about what medication a child takes with another family, you need to be ready to say, just like I wouldn't share information about your child with Ria's family, I can't share about Ria's story right now. Let's talk about how to support your child when they have questions about another child's gender.
I'm going to read this quote real quick where it says, "Listen earnestly to anything your children want to tell you, no matter what. If you don't listen eagerly to the little stuff when they are little, they won't tell you the big stuff when they are big, because to them, all of it has always been big stuff." This quote by Catherine Wallace is so important to supporting the upbringing of our children and actually listening to them. When we start listening to them, and by listening, I mean truly taking in their words, emotions, reactions, and more, we instill an ongoing trust in that what they are saying is valuable. Listening to them will open the doors for continuous trust in listening to them as they get older. So then we ask ourselves, well, why should we listen to our children or our students? Well, this is because it affirms who they are. Many LGBTQ youth have experiences of not being listened to nor being affirmed by their immediate family. This is not only detrimental to their well-being, but also their health. And from the 2022 Trevor Project National Survey, we see that of the nearly 34,000 LGBTQ youth polled ages 13 to 24 across the US, that about 14% had attempted suicide and 45% seriously considered it in the past year. The Family Acceptance Project protects our children from mental health issues such as depression, suicide, anxiety, and more. And we also see that almost 10% of youth ages 13 to 17 in the US also identify as LGBTQ. In fact, can you all guess what the percentage of Gen Z, so our youth born 1997 to 2003, are LGBTQ according to a recent Gallup poll? I'll give you all a moment to think. So 21%, or about 1 in 5 of Gen Z are LGBTQ according to that 2022 Gallup poll. But I do want to note that this percentage may be higher because the poll did exclude youth born between 2003 and 2012, since they're technically not legal adults, and members of Gen Z who have turned 18 since 2017 are twice as likely as older members of the generation to identify as LGBT. So it's clear that there is a need to have these conversations early on because our youth are dynamic, challenging gendered norms and cultural norms, and we should be prepared to support these conversations and build the language to affirm them. Many folks might be asking themselves, where do I even start? Well, by being here, you're already off to a great start. Another way to get started is by learning about the LGBTQ community through resources. So here's a couple of examples. The first being this resource called Building Blocks for Breaking the Binary. It was created by friends, collaborators, and partners of the Pride Center in honor of Transgender Day of Remembrance, and was made with the intention to spread resources about breaking the binary. As a reminder, this resource and many others will be shared with you through a QR code at the end of this presentation.
So once again, let's practice. Like last time, I'll share a scenario and then ask you to think about what you could say or do in response. So Dashel, a child in your classroom, often comes into school later than most of the families. His parents often talk about what a struggle it is to get him dressed in the mornings, though he often gets messy and changes clothes at school, happily picking whatever he wants from the extra clothes bin you provide. One morning in particular sounds really tough, and Dashel's dad is clearly still frustrated with him as he puts his yesterday's extra clothes back in the clothes bin and says goodbye. As Dashel paints later in the day, you notice that he seems to be intentionally putting paint on his school clothes when he doesn't realize you're watching him, not getting messy by accident. As he finishes painting, he smiles and asks to get changed. He picks out the same unicorn shirt and with reversible sequins and embroidered jeans that his dad just returned to the extra bins clothes at drop off. He keeps petting the shirt and smiling the rest of the day. At pickup, his dad says, he always has those same shirt and jeans on at pickup. What's been happening at school? So I'll give you a minute to think about it. What might you say in response? One thing we've heard is, Dashel got paint on his clothes when he was painting, and we let every child choose their clothes from the extra clothes bin. But I do notice that Dashel smiles a lot when he wears these clothes. Or, Dashel, your dad's thinking a lot about the clothes you're wearing. I wonder what you like about those clothes. And depending on the family's reaction and response in the moment, I might say something like, you seem concerned about Dashel's clothes in the process of getting dressed. I'd really like to get a chance to hear you about your concerns and about how it's going at home. Can we set up a time to chat? I want to create an affirming space for the child and for the parent. So sometimes moving into talking about this away from the child can be a really helpful step. I also want to think about how much we don't want to assume what any one action means. Yes, there are times when children's first step into expressing their gender identity comes through their clothes. And there are other times when a child just really likes flippy sequins. And so we want to help the parents help the kids slow down and listen to each other. But we also want to be really careful about not outing a child. They may be finding a safe space to express themselves at school that they don't have at home. And so I want to think about getting the child's permission before I have these conversations. So it might be that my first step is to talk with Dashiell about their clothes before I talk with the parents, noticing that this is a recurring pattern. So checking in to say, I'm noticing you keep picking different clothes than your family has for you. Is there anything you want to talk about that? Do you want help talking to your parents about that? And letting the child set the pace and answer those questions. So we just shared a lot of information with all of you, and we're not done, but we do want to take a moment to take a breath and really remember that this is a learning journey. We've all started where we've started for really valid reasons. Whether you feel like a novice or like your ideas are being reaffirmed by this presentation, we all have more we can learn. Some or all of this information may be really new for you, and learning new things can feel uncomfortable or overwhelming. Please remember that it is also a process, and this information does become more familiar. And this could be really exciting, familiar but helpful, or something else entirely. Thank you for taking this time to listen to us and each other, for being open to learning more, practicing new skills, and taking steps to create a safer world. We know that the more we create acceptance and support for LGBTQ plus young people, the healthier and happier they will be.
So we're not done yet, but we hope that all of you understand that the LGBTQ community is authentic, courageous, and resilient. And by attending this workshop, you can all practice and demonstrate these qualities with the children in your lives so they can feel affirmed. We're going to pause for a minute to give you a little time to absorb and reflect before we move on to the next part of this workshop. We've done so much work in expanding our knowledge and ideas about identities, stereotypes, and beyond. Let's keep this going. One huge way to make a difference in trans and gender diverse people's lives is to use their name and pronouns. And pronouns are little words we use to refer to someone as an opportunity to make them feel known and supported. And it's another way trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people are creating language for ourselves or integrating meaning into words we already use. So you may hear words used in ways you were taught not to, like using they, them, theirs for a single person, either because it's their preference or because you didn't know their preferences yet. Or you may hear new pronouns like a, em, or airs instead. And those are called neopronouns, and they are another form of third-person gender-neutral language similar to they, them, theirs. So it's okay to ask someone their pronouns when you meet them, but also it's important to offer your own. And when talking with young ones, you can ask, what words do you want people to use when they talk about you? And then offer some suggestions. Some people want he or she or they or just their name. What would you like? We understand it can be tricky to integrate new words or new language usage in your vocabulary, so we recommend you practice. I'll give you all a moment to read through the slide, and if folks at home would like to pause real quick, the video, and just read over the sentence. How this activity will work is that even though I won't be able to hear each other, or we won't be able to hear each other, I'm going to encourage you all to practice the pronouns out loud with me. So I'm going to read the paragraph, and wherever you see the underlined blank line, you're going to say the pronoun out loud. And of course, if you need some extra practice, you can totally pause if you're at home. But really, we just want folks to practice and just get comfortable using different pronouns. So once again, if folks want to pause and read through it, I'll go ahead and start. So again, I'm going to read the paragraph. Teacher Aiko uses they, them, theirs pronouns. Again, they, them, theirs pronouns. Now you all say out loud. They have been a preschool teacher for 18 years. One of Aiko's favorite memories is when they celebrated their birthday with the children by having a wiggle worm dance party. They were teaching the children about the science of dirt. Aiko keeps a photo of the party in their kitchen. And again, if you're able to, you can totally take a picture of the slide for practice, or if you're at home, you can rewind this video and practice again. So I invite folks to kind of share with other folks in the space. How did it feel practicing with this pronoun? We can go to the next slide. And here's another opportunity to practice. Once again, I'll give y'all a few moments to read over the slide, and then wherever you see the underlined subject or possessive adjective, you all will say that pronoun out loud. And feel free to pause if you're at home. All right, here we go. Nico's parent, Raina, uses am, heirs pronouns. Again, Raina uses am, heirs pronouns. When Nico's class was learning about teeth, Raina came in to read a story because A is a dentist. Raina brought some of heir dental tools to show the children, and also some photos of heir teeth before and after a filling. The children are still talking about M. So good job. Once again, if folks are at home and want to rewind this video to practice again, we invite y'all to do that. Or if you're at the conference, feel free to talk with your neighbor about how it felt to practice with this pronoun set. And again, if you'd like to take a picture of the slide, you can for later practice and to share. Another great way to keep practicing is with the website practicewithpronouns.com. It's a website that's named well because it lets you practice with diverse pronouns. And again, it's called practicewithpronouns.com.
Another way to bring language and identity to children is through stories. Stories are an incredible way to share ideas. Stories can come to us in movies, books, TikTok videos, all kinds of places. But as we talked about before, a lot of published stories have their downsides. For example, Goodnight, Goodnight Construction Site is a favorite book of so many toddlers, but all of the trucks have he pronouns. Fairy tales have been loved by children for generations, but so many of them feature girls being victims, boys putting themselves in danger, and love that's only between a man and a woman. Fortunately, we have the power to change what stories are told. For example, I can always change the pronouns of the trucks when I read the book. So no one's as tough and strong as she, but now she's sleepy as can be. And we can choose books and videos that have gender diverse or gender expansive characters, feature different families, and tell stories about love in inclusive ways. We will provide some recommendations in the handout if you're in the video or through the link, the QR code at the end. The more it's clear that there is a market for these stories, the more that writers will write them and publishers and producers will publish them. And we can create our own stories. There will always be times when the story we want just isn't out there yet. And it can be fun to make up a story. So here's an example of one we made up. A prince was captured by a dragon that took the prince to her lair. Oh, however am I going to escape this mess? The prince cried. Suddenly, a knight in shining armor rode into the lair on his white horse and scared the dragon away. My hero, said the prince, and they lived happily ever after. And here's another one. Sonny the snail was an adventurous snail. They spent their day in a lush garden filled with flowers, vegetables, and shady trees. Sometimes Sonny would sit near the side of a mossy stone when the days were hot, so they could keep themselves cool and protected. Other days, Sonny would creep out of their little spot near the rock and slime their way as high as they could along the smooth branches of the apple tree to take a peek around. Sonny liked seeing things from a different perspective. Who could you tell stories about? What stories do you think are missing from the children's lives? Another way we can start to make a little more room for each other is by using more gender-neutral language. So again, I'm going to invite you to think about a possible response as I read the slide to you. With each different bubble, I'll make a suggestion and give you a moment to think about your idea. So for the first one, you're at the park and coming up with ideas for how to help a child find a playmate. Instead of assuming the other child's gender based on appearance. So for example, saying, maybe that boy in the sandbox would like to play. You could say, maybe the child in the sandbox would like to play. Or, there's a possible new friend who might like to play in the sandbox. Instead of saying mom and dad, or even parents, you could say, did Chihu's family come to school today? Did Chihu's grown-ups come to school today? And instead of addressing a group as boys and girls or ladies and gentlemen, we could say, friends, it's time to clean up for the day. Or even, everyone, it's time to clean up for the day. I'm sure you all came up with some great ideas too.